No one enters the forest believing they will not return, especially those who think they understand that forest. Jacob Mills and Aaron Seiler were not reckless men. They were not drunk, not daring nature, not treating the wilderness as a game. They were young men who loved the outdoors in a very American way. They trusted maps. They trusted experience. They trusted that if you respected the forest would allow you to pass through and come home. But the forest is not always fair. 17 days. That is how long Jacob and Aaron vanished inside Cataloochee Valley. No signal, no trace, no recorded cry for help. And for all 17 of those days, hundreds of people moved through those woods, calling their names into the fog, crossing icy streams, sweeping flashlights across every tree trunk and ravine. No one knew that two men were still breathing, still alive, only a few miles of forest away. When people talk about disappearances in the Appalachian wilderness, they usually think of getting lost, accidents, or the brutal force of nature. But this case was unlike anything that had come before, because Jacob and Aaron did not die, and they were not allowed to live either. They existed in a suspended state between the two, held, forgotten, stripped of their voices, their agency, and even the right to disappear naturally. For 17 days, their families survived on the thinnest strand of hope, a missed call, a weak signal, a voice echoing back from deep in the trees. Jacob's mother sat beside the radio every night, afraid to sleep. Aaron's father walked with the search teams until his legs went numb. None of them were ready to accept the worst, because their instincts told them something was wrong. Two grown men, experienced, prepared. They could not simply vanish like this. And then, when they were finally found, the world realized a truth more terrifying than death itself. Someone had kept them there. Someone had decided they would not be allowed to die right away. This story is not only about two men who survived. It is about 17 days in which evil existed alongside life. And the forest, a silent witness, chose to keep that secret for a very long time. This is a story about what happens when someone believes they have the right to control another person's life. And about two men who survived, not because the forest spared them, but because they were not yet permitted to die. Jacob Mills and Aaron Seiler were not thrill seekers. They did not go into the mountains to test fate, and they were not looking for danger. They went into the forest because it was the only place that made them feel like they were living as their true selves. Jacob was 25 years old, quiet, and careful. He had a habit of writing everything down: routes, departure times, wind direction, even small details like water levels in the streams or the slope of a ridgeline. Inside Jacob's backpack there was always a small notebook, not a journal of feelings, but a journal of control. Writing things down was his way of making sure the world around him still made sense. Aaron was the opposite. 27 years old, talkative, quick to smile, easy to strike up a conversation with a stranger. But appearances could be misleading. Once inside the forest, Aaron was always the most observant one. He usually walked half a step behind Jacob, not because he was weaker, but because he wanted to make sure nothing was left unseen behind them. They met during a freshman hiking trip at Western Carolina University. Two strangers, breathing hard on the same mountainside, looking down at a valley wrapped in white mist, and feeling the exact same thing, that they belonged on trails, not in the narrow concrete hallways of lecture buildings. From that moment on, they became companions. Not loud, not attention-seeking, just two young men who shared the belief that nature never betrays those who respect it. Jacob's family said he changed every time he came back from the forest. Quieter, but calmer. As if the worries of modern life had been left somewhere among the trees. His mother was used to receiving a message before every trip: "I am going up for 2 days. I will be back on Sunday." Always the same. Aaron usually called his father after each trek, just to talk about small things. A beautiful stream, a colder morning than expected, moments that might seem ordinary to others. But to Aaron, they were proof that he was still connected to the world. For them, the forest was not a place to run away. It was a place to rebalance, a space where academic pressure and anxiety about the future fell silent for a while. That was why everyone believed they knew what they were doing, that they would not take reckless risks, that they would not go too far, that if something went wrong, they would leave a sign. No one imagined that two people who understood the forest so well could disappear without a message, a note, or a single distress signal. No one believed that the skills they had built over years would not be enough to bring them home. And no one knew that in the final moments when they were still themselves, Jacob and Aaron believed the place they were entering was safe. That this forest, like every forest before it, would allow them to leave. That belief later became the detail that haunted investigators the most. Because two careful men, experienced and deeply respectful of nature, do not simply vanish. And if they did not leave the trail on their own, then it means someone forced them to turn in a different direction. Friday, October 19, 2007. Cataloochee Valley was entering the moment between seasons. Cold air rolled down into the valley earlier than usual, carrying thick, damp fog with it. The treetops changed color slowly, yellow, brown, then deep red, beautiful enough to make people forget that beauty can also hide danger. Jacob and Aaron left the university campus in the early afternoon. An old Jeep Cherokee rolled steadily toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. No rush, no concern, just a short trip before final exams waiting ahead. Jacob told his sister he would be back Sunday evening. Just 2 days, he said, a break to regain balance before returning to schoolwork. Aaron sent a message to his roommate, bragging that they had found a beautiful campsite near a ridgeline overlooking a winding river below. The afternoon passed quietly. They drove along familiar roads, where cell service began to weaken and then disappeared entirely. To Jacob and Aaron, this was not a warning sign. It was the feeling of being cut off from the world. At around 8 in the evening, they stopped at a small roadside gas station. Security cameras captured the two men walking into the store, heavy jackets on, relaxed expressions on their faces. They bought snacks, a few supplies for the trip, and 2 thermoses filled with hot coffee. In that grainy footage, they laughed and talked, completely unaware that they were leaving behind the final image of peace. The last message was sent at 7:42 in the evening. Aaron wrote that they had just found a perfect spot, right before the turnoff leading into deeper forest. There was no sense of urgency, no worry hidden in the words. After the gas station, the road narrowed. Headlights cut through the thick fog, reflecting off wet tree trunks. The temperature dropped quickly. Silence began to settle in. According to the plan, they would drive a little farther, park the vehicle, then hike into a familiar camping area, a route Jacob had already noted in his notebook, a trip they had taken many times before. Except this time the fog was heavier, and night came sooner. No one knows exactly what happened after that moment. There was no emergency call, no distress signal, no sound from the forest beyond the wind and dry leaves. As night fell over Cataloochee Valley, 2 young men stepped into the woods believing they would return on Sunday, that everything was under control, that this was just another ordinary weekend, like so many before it. They did not know that from the moment the Jeep's wheels left the main road, time for them had begun to move in a completely different way. The Jeep was found on Monday morning, when concern had begun to outweigh patience. It was parked neatly along the edge of a Forest Service road, near Black Hollow Gap, not plunged into a ravine, not stuck in mud, simply pulled over, straight and orderly, as if its owners intended to return in just a moment. The doors were locked. The windows rolled all the way up. There were no signs of forced entry. Inside, everything was still there. 2 backpacks placed neatly in the back, a folded topographic map, a pair of gloves, and on the passenger seat, Jacob's notebook, the one he never entered the forest without. Only one thing was missing: the car keys. To anyone experienced in the wilderness, that detail immediately created an uneasy silence. No one walks deep into the forest and leaves their keys behind. And no one locks a vehicle if they believe they are not coming back. Investigators stood beside the Jeep, quietly observing. There was no blood, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. Nothing suggested that the 2 men had panicked. Everything was too clean, too orderly, too unlike an accident. If Jacob and Aaron had simply walked into the forest to set up camp, they would have taken their backpacks. If something had gone wrong, they would have left signs of survival. If they had become lost, they would have tried to return to the vehicle. But the backpacks remained. The map lay untouched, and the Jeep stayed locked, as if confirming that nothing unexpected had happened here. A park ranger later said that moment sent a chill down his spine, because the scene told no story. It felt like a silent period, a place where all movement had been abruptly cut off. Jacob was obsessively careful. He never left his vehicle without preparation. Aaron was the same. Both understood that in the forest, the smallest mistake could cost a life. And yet they left the jeep as if someone were standing right beside them, as if there was no time to think. Or worse, as if they believed they had no choice. Search teams combed the area around the vehicle. No clear footprints. No drag marks. No broken branches pointing in any direction. Only fog and cold, wet ground. One investigator wrote in his report that the scene did not fit any typical missing persons scenario. No accident. No voluntary disappearance. No reckless behavior. The locked jeep became the symbol of the entire case. An inanimate object, holding far too many unanswered questions. If they left the vehicle on their own, why did they take nothing with them? If they were forced to leave, why was there no sign of violence? And if someone else was involved, why was everything so quiet? As night fell over the search area that day, many people began thinking the thought no one wanted to say out loud, that perhaps Jacob and Aaron did not enter the forest alone, and that the moment they stepped away from that locked jeep was the moment control no longer belonged to them. The first days of a search are always the days when people still believe. They believe that if they walk far enough and call out loudly enough, the missing will hear and answer. They believe the forest is only testing them, not yet ready to take anything away. On Monday morning, search teams began spreading out from the location of the jeep. Park rangers, local police, volunteers, all entering the forest with the same assumption. Two young men, experienced, probably just lost or dealing with a minor setback. But the forest that day did not feel like any other day. The fog was thick, hanging so low it reached their knees. Cold rain fell without pause, softening the ground and erasing every footprint almost as soon as it formed. With every step, there was the unsettling feeling that the forest itself was trying to hide something. Helicopters flew for hours above the valley, but from the air, everything blurred into a single shade of gray. Visibility was less than 50 feet. Not enough to see a person. Not enough to see hope. On the ground, search teams called their names over and over. Jacob, Aaron. The voices echoed, then dissolved among cold, wet trees. There was no answer. No strange sound. Only wind and rain. At Jacob's home in Asheville, his mother slipped into a state of sleepless waiting. She called her son's phone again and again, receiving nothing but a dead signal. The phone stayed beside her, the screen always lit, as if she believed that if she looked away for even a second, her son would call back at that exact moment. Aaron's family reacted differently. His father, a former firefighter, could not sit still. He drove straight to the search area and joined the volunteer teams without being asked. He walked the ridgelines, studied every tree base, every rock crevice, as if the instinct of a man who had once saved lives would not allow him to stand aside. On the second day, the search area expanded. Tracking dogs were brought in. They circled the jeep, then led the teams north for about half a mile before stopping. They froze, whimpered, and turned back. The human scent, something that never vanishes suddenly, ended without explanation. A park ranger later said that moment was the first sign that this was not an ordinary lost hiker case, because people do not disappear like that. By the third day, volunteers were growing exhausted. Clothes soaked through, boots heavy with mud, voices raw from calling out names in the rain. But the families did not leave. Jacob's mother sat at the ranger station every evening, close to the radio. She did not speak much. She only listened. Each time a signal crackled through, she lifted her head, hope filling her eyes, then lowered it again when the name was not her son's. By the end of the fourth day, something began to spread, even though no one said it out loud. This silence was not normal. No campsite, no survival signs, none of the usual mistakes made by people who get lost. Then, late one afternoon, a volunteer found something that changed the entire atmosphere. A glove, soaked through, slightly torn, lying tight against the base of a tree. It had not fallen there. It had not been blown by the wind. It looked as though it had been placed there. When confirmation came that the glove belonged to Aaron, many people on the search teams fell silent, because from that moment on, they understood one thing. Jacob and Aaron were not simply missing. Someone had been very close to them, and perhaps was still very close. From the fifth day on, the search entered a different phase. The early optimism was gone. The simple assumptions disappeared. In their place was a growing unease that crept into every step taken into the forest. Tracking dogs were brought in from Asheville. These were dogs with long records of successful searches, animals familiar with the Blue Ridge terrain. They started at the Jeep, carefully working every door seam, every patch of dried mud beneath the undercarriage. At first, everything seemed clear. They picked up a human scent and led the search teams north. Rangers followed closely behind, marking every stretch of ground. For a moment, it felt like direction had finally been found. But less than a mile in, everything stopped. The dogs slowed, then froze in place. They circled, whined, pulled at their leads as if confused. The human scent was gone. Not fading, not thinning out, but ending completely. A handler later said that this almost never happens naturally. Human scent does not simply stop in the middle of a forest unless something interferes, unless it is transferred to another vehicle, or deliberately concealed. The search team stood still among the trees. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood what that moment meant. From that point on, they were no longer tracking lost hikers. They were following the trace of something else entirely. Drones, equipped with thermal cameras, began scanning the ridgelines. From above, the forest appeared as a dense, living mass, nearly without gaps. Heat signatures flickered and vanished. Deer, bears, raccoons. No signs of human presence. On the ground, volunteers continued combing every square foot. They searched for the smallest details: a snapped branch, a patch of disturbed soil, a faint shoe print. Eventually, they found a few impressions in the mud, possibly hiking boots, possibly two people. Investigators measured them, photographed them, compared them to the boots Jacob and Aaron had been wearing. But just a few yards later, the prints vanished. No signs of a fall, no drag marks, no indication they had changed direction. It was as if they had stepped off the earth itself. The weather offered no help. Rain continued to fall, day after day. Water washed away every trace almost as soon as it appeared. The forest changed by the hour, as if actively erasing what humans tried to record. A veteran ranger later said that in all his years of service, he had never seen a search so empty. Not because there was nothing to look for, but because everything had already been taken away. The silence of the forest began to feel heavy. No longer the peaceful quiet of nature, but the silence of a place that had witnessed something and chosen to keep it. By the end of the 6th day, the search teams returned to the station completely exhausted. No new leads had been found. No one dared to voice the thought forming in their minds that Jacob and Aaron may not have left the forest on their own feet, that perhaps the forest was not what swallowed them, but the place that concealed the traces of a human hand. As the search dragged on without new leads, something else began to happen. The questions no longer stayed inside investigation files. They started to spread outward, slipping into diners, gas stations, and the wooden porches of small towns pressed up against the forest. In places like Cataloochee Valley, people believe in the woods, not in a romantic sense, but with a respect mixed with fear. Locals understand that the forest has its own rules, and they also understand that not everything that disappears is an accident. An employee at a gas station near the search area later recalled that Friday night. She said that besides Jacob and Aaron, there were 3 other men around the area at the same time. They stood outside, drinking beer, talking loudly. The way they looked toward the Jeep made her uncomfortable. Security cameras at the station captured a few blurry frames. 3 shadows, 3 figures standing next to a pickup truck. Headlights washed out most of the details. Not clear enough to identify faces, but clear enough to confirm that Jacob and Aaron were not the only ones who stopped there that night. In small diners, people began to whisper that there were those who did not like outsiders, that there were people who believed these mountains belonged to them, that there had been small confrontations before, never reported, because no one wanted trouble. An older man in town told a search volunteer that there are roads here that do not exist on any map. There are people who live so close to the forest they do not need tracks to move through it. And there are things that, if they happen, no one will ever say out loud. At first, investigators did not treat these rumors as official leads. They were too vague, too emotional. But when there was nothing else to hold on to, every small detail gained weight. One ranger noted that the sudden loss of scent by the tracking dogs could fit a theory involving vehicle interference. Another recalled reports of a pickup truck speeding along a gravel road near Black Hollow Gap that same night. No one saw the license plate clearly, only the sound of an engine rising, then disappearing into the fog. 3 people. 3 blurred figures. No names. No faces. The rumors began to take shape. Not clearly, but enough to change the atmosphere within the search teams. Eyes grew more cautious. Questions were asked more quietly, but more deeply. Jacob and Aaron's families heard those whispers. No one said anything to them directly, but they felt it. The fear was no longer just about being lost in the woods. It became fear of other people. In small towns, rumors have a life of their own. They do not need proof to exist. They exist because people sense that something is wrong. And in this case, that feeling only grew stronger. That Jacob and Aaron did not simply wander into the forest, but may have crossed paths with people who did not want to be seen. The three mysterious figures still had no names, but from that moment on, they became part of the story. By the 10th day of the search, most people had begun preparing themselves for the worst. No one said it out loud, but everyone could feel it drawing closer. The weather turned sharply colder. At night, temperatures in the valley dropped to near freezing. Those who once believed Jacob and Aaron were simply lost now grew quieter, more withdrawn. Then, on an evening that seemed unremarkable, a local hunter called the ranger station. His voice shook, slow and uncertain, as if he himself could not fully believe what he had heard. He said that while walking along Devil's Backbone Ridge, he heard voices rising from below a ravine, not shouting, not screaming, but faint, broken sounds, like someone speaking in deep exhaustion. He heard two different voices. One sounded like it was praying. The other whispered words that made no sense. In the forest, sound can deceive. Wind moves through rock gaps. Branches strike against one another. But this hunter had lived here his entire life. He knew the difference between forest noise and human voices. The next morning, search teams immediately moved toward Devil's Backbone. The terrain there was more dangerous than any area they had already searched. Steep slopes, rain-slick rock, vegetation so dense that even daylight fractured into pockets of shadow. They called out Jacob and Aaron's names. They fired signal flares. They scanned with thermal cameras. There was no response. After hours of fruitless searching, as the teams prepared to pull back, one ranger stopped. He looked up at a tall tree. There, two short lengths of rope hung loosely from a low branch. The knots were fresh, not rotted, not faded. Below them, the bark had been worn smooth in an unnatural way, as if something had rubbed against it day after day. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any explanation could have been. Rope does not belong to the forest. It does not appear on its own. And those knots were not the careless kind tied by campers. Investigators collected the rope, logged the location, photographed every detail. No one was ready to draw conclusions. But everyone understood this was not an old trace. A ranger later said that what he felt in that moment was not hope. It was fear. Because if there was rope, then someone had brought it there. And if someone brought it there, then Jacob and Aaron had never been alone in that forest. That discovery forced the search to expand once more. Helicopters returned. More drones were deployed. More volunteers arrived. But at the same time, a new fear took shape. If the voices in the ravine were real, then the question was no longer where they had gone. It became, who had kept them there, and why they were still not allowed to leave. Day 17. The number appeared in reports like a technical marker. But for Jacob and Aaron's families, it was a suspended sentence, hanging without being spoken aloud. That morning, fog still blanketed the valley. The forest was so quiet that wet leaves could be heard falling to the ground. Search teams gathered at the ranger station to hear an announcement everyone expected, but no one was ready to accept. The large-scale search would be scaled back, not because they believed Jacob and Aaron had been found, but because resources were running out, because the weather was growing harsher, and because cold statistics showed that the chance of survival after 17 days in those conditions was almost non-existent. The words were delivered calmly, but no one in the room felt calm. Some volunteers quietly removed their gloves, folded their rain jackets. They had done everything they could, that is what they said. But in their eyes, something still felt unfinished. Jacob's family did not leave. His mother remained in her familiar chair near the radio. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply stared toward the forest, as if believing that as long as she did not look away, her son would not be forgotten. Aaron's father slept in his pickup truck, parked near the trailhead. Every morning, he stepped out, took a long breath of cold air, and asked the same question: "Is there anything new today?" And every day, the answer was the same. Scaling back the search did not mean stopping completely. A few small teams continued working the most dangerous areas. places they had once hoped they would never have to enter. But everyone understood that from this point forward, the nature of the case had changed. This was no longer a rescue. It was a waiting for a sign, waiting for a miracle, or waiting for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In town, people spoke less about finding the two young men. They talked instead about the weather, about the coming winter, as if doing so allowed them to avoid facing what was happening in the woods. Night fell earlier. Temperatures dropped quickly. Somewhere among the darkened trees, no one knew where Jacob and Aaron were, alive, or no longer. But there was one thought no one on the search teams dared to say out loud. If they were still alive after 17 days, then they could not have been there alone. And if they were not alone, then it meant that somewhere in this silent forest, someone else was still there. The morning of November 5th, 2007, the 17th day since Jacob and Aaron disappeared. The search had been scaled back. Hope was nearly gone. At the same time, several miles outside the original search area, a group of 6 hikers from Tennessee began their trek. They were not a rescue team, not volunteers, just people who loved the forest, the way Jacob and Aaron once had. The weather that day was unusually clear. The sky was a pale, cold blue. The ground was still damp from a heavy rain 2 days earlier. They followed a narrow stream, the water moving slowly, crystal clear, almost cruelly peaceful. Near midday, one person in the group stopped. He saw something on the opposite bank. At first, he thought it was a piece of fabric caught in the brush. When he moved closer, he realized it was not fabric. It was human skin. The entire group froze. No one spoke. In front of them, on either side of the narrow stream, were 2 human bodies positioned against tree trunks, upright, arms and legs bound tightly with rope. In the first instant, all of them believed they were too late, that they were looking at 2 dead men. Then someone screamed. He saw the chest of one of them move, just slightly, like a final breath that had not yet been released. Another person dropped to his knees, trembling as he placed his hand on the other man's neck. The pulse was weak, but real. They were alive. The call to 911 was made in panic. The voice on the other end kept asking for confirmation. 2 men, tied to trees, still breathing. 17 days. It took nearly 40 minutes for rescue teams to reach the location. When rangers and medical personnel arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. What they saw did not resemble any rescue they had encountered before. Jacob and Aaron were bound in almost identical ways. Arms spread around the tree trunks, rope cut deep into flesh, clothes torn apart, faces swollen, pale, coated in mud and insect bites. Both men were terrifyingly thin, as if their bodies had been slowly drained in silence. There were no signs of animal attack, no severe injuries from a fall, only prolonged starvation and exhaustion. They did not respond to light. They did not respond to voices, but they were breathing. A medic later said it was the most haunting scene of his career. 2 people still alive, yet suspended between 2 worlds. Jacob and Aaron were airlifted immediately. The sound of rotor blades tore through the forest silence. For the first time in 17 days, the woods were forced to give them back. When the news reached the ranger station, people could not believe what they were hearing. Jacob's mother collapsed in a hospital hallway. Aaron's father stood motionless beside his son's bed, saying nothing, his hand gripping the metal rail. The 2 young men had been found, alive, but the real question was no longer where they had been. It was, who had kept them there for 17 days, and why they had been allowed to survive. Being found did not close the case. It only opened another door, darker, and far more terrifying. Jacob and Aaron were taken directly to Asheville Medical Center that night. The emergency room doors closed, leaving behind a crowd that did not know whether to feel relief or fear. They had been found, alive, but that was all anyone could say with certainty at that moment. Inside the intensive care unit, harsh white lights shone down on 2 motionless bodies. Machines hummed in steady, indifferent rhythms, IV lines, breathing tubes, blinking numbers in place of words. Jacob lay there, so thin that his jawbone stood out sharply beneath pale skin. Aaron looked the same, eyes shut tight. No response to voices, no reaction to light. Doctors described it as a coma caused by extreme exhaustion and chemical exposure. A clinical phrase, but for their families, it meant something far simpler. They were alive, but they had not come back yet. Test results silenced the entire medical team. Both men had high levels of a livestock sedative in their blood, not a recreational drug, not something that could be taken by accident, but a compound typically found only in veterinary clinics and farms. More disturbing still were signs that it had not been administered just once. The bruising around their wrists and ankles had begun to heal. That meant they had been bound for many days. Someone had returned. Someone had checked on them. Someone had made sure they were still breathing. No one said this out loud in the hospital corridors, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Jacob and Aaron had not been saved by chance. They had been kept alive. Family members were allowed in one by one. Jacob's mother collapsed when she saw her son. She touched his hand gently, afraid that pressing too hard might make him disappear. She whispered apologies, as if failing to find him sooner were her fault. Aaron's father stood beside the bed, his hand gripping the metal rail. A man who had once run into fires to save others, now powerless to do anything but watch his son breathe through machines. Doctors said they would need time, a great deal of time. The drugs in their systems were strong enough to slow brain activity. Memories might be fragmented. Some things might never return the way they once were. Outside the hospital, the media began calling it a miracle. 2 missing college students found alive after 17 days. But inside those white walls, no one called it a miracle, because miracles do not leave deep rope marks carved into skin. They do not leave chemicals in the bloodstream. They do not leave behind the haunting question of who decided that these 2 men would be allowed to live one more day. Jacob and Aaron lay there, alive, but not awake. And when they finally opened their eyes, what awaited them would not be just the sterile light of a hospital room. It would be the memory of 17 days that someone had deliberately turned into a void. When Jacob and Aaron were confirmed alive, the case immediately changed direction. It was no longer a search, no longer a rescue. It became a retracing. Investigators understood one thing with absolute clarity. Those 2 men could not have tied themselves to trees. They could not have injected themselves with sedatives. And they certainly could not have vanished for 17 days in the forest without leaving a trace. The truth was not buried deep in the woods. It lay earlier. The investigative team began moving backward through the final timeline. Receipts, security cameras, cell phone signals, the small things people leave behind, even when they do not realize it. That was when a name surfaced in the file. Big Ben's Grill, a roadside diner along Highway 276. Not upscale, not memorable, but a place almost everyone passing through the area stopped at least once. Truck drivers, locals, and people heading into the woods. Exterior security footage was pulled. Black and white images, grainy, slightly shaking in the wind. Jacob and Aaron appeared in frame a little after 8 in the evening. They sat at a corner table, eating dinner, talking, laughing. Nothing out of the ordinary, until 3 other men entered the frame. They did not look directly at the camera, but in several brief moments, their eyes were fixed on Jacob and Aaron's table. These men were not familiar faces to investigators, but they were familiar to the town. One of them was identified as Travis Dell, a local mechanic, previously mentioned in several disturbance reports. Quick-tempered, a heavy drinker, openly hostile toward outsiders. A waitress later recalled that there had been a tense exchange in the parking lot that night. No shouting, no physical fight, but enough to make it memorable. A few short remarks, a mocking tone, an unfriendly stare. When phone records were cross-referenced, one detail brought the investigators to a standstill. Travis Dell's phone, along with 2 other prepaid numbers, had pinged from the Devil's Backbone Ridge area during the period when Jacob and Aaron disappeared. Not once, but multiple times. 3 phones, 3 signals, moving along the same path. That was no longer coincidence. What had once been town rumor began to take solid shape. No longer shadows in the fog, but real people, with names, with histories, with motive. One investigator later said that Big Ben's Grill was not just the place where Jacob and Aaron ate their last normal meal. It was where they were noticed, watched, and possibly chosen. The backward investigation did not bring relief. It brought a growing cold in the chest, because every step closer to the truth confirmed the same thing. Jacob and Aaron did not disappear because of the forest. They disappeared because of people, and the question was no longer what happened. It became, who decided to turn an ordinary dinner into the starting point of 17 days in hell. Travis Dell was not a stranger in town. He was the kind of man everyone recognized, but no one truly wanted to be close to. a local mechanic, living year-round with the smell of motor oil, alcohol, and anger he never quite controlled. To most people, Travis was just a rough, unpleasant guy. But in police records, his name had appeared more than once. Disturbances, threats, confrontations with tourists and outsiders. Nothing serious enough to land him in prison, but enough to form a familiar pattern. A man who felt looked down on, pushed to the margins, and constantly searching for a way to reclaim control. The other two men, Eli and Cole, were Travis's relatives. They grew up together, worked together, shared the same space, and the same simmering resentment toward the outside world. They were not the masterminds, but they were men who did not know when to stop. Investigators slowly came to understand that the motive did not begin on the night Jacob and Aaron disappeared. It had existed long before that. Months earlier, in a bar in Maggie Valley, Travis had gotten into a small confrontation with two college hikers. Words exchanged, a shove, a few laughs from people nearby. To anyone else, it would have been just a bad night. But to Travis, it was humiliation. He brought it up again and again, told the story to Eli and Cole, and every time he told it, the story twisted a little more. The words grew sharper. The looks became challenges. In the psychology of men like Travis, respect is not something that can be shared. It must be taken, and if necessary, forced. When Travis saw Jacob and Aaron at Big Ben's grill, he did not see two students. He saw faces that represented everything that made him feel small. According to later testimony, the original intention was only to scare them, to frighten them, to make them understand that these woods did not belong to them. But power is addictive, and once a person realizes they can control another human being, moral boundaries begin to blur. Criminal psychology experts later concluded that the case showed clear signs of control and humiliation, not robbery, not sexual motive, but domination, tying them to trees, injecting them with sedatives so they could not resist, returning again and again to check whether they were still breathing. None of it was random. It was a ritual of power. One detail from testimony sent a chill through investigators. The cutting of hair and fingernails. There was no practical reason for it, except one: to turn victims into objects, to strip away individuality, to make them something no longer fully human. Eli and Cole said that after about a week, they began to feel afraid. Not afraid of what they had done, but afraid of being discovered. They wanted to stop, but Travis did not. One sentence appeared again and again in his statements: "They are still breathing. That is enough." That line revealed everything. To Travis, keeping Jacob and Aaron alive was not mercy. It was proof that he was still in control of the game. And it was there that the true pathology of the crime became clear. Not deep personal hatred, but a wounded ego, combined with absolute power, placed inside a forest where no one was watching. A perfect formula for atrocity. And when investigators finally assembled the full picture, they understood that the most terrifying part of this story was not the forest. It was people. When given the chance to control another person's life, and choosing not to turn back. It took many days after hospitalization before Jacob and Aaron could speak in complete sentences. The sedatives withdrew slowly from their bodies. Memories returned in fragments, out of order, disconnected, like nightmares flashing on and off in broad daylight. The attack happened on the very first night. They had just finished setting up their tent, eaten a simple meal, and crawled into their sleeping bags as the forest settled into silence. Jacob clearly remembers the first sound. Not an animal, but footsteps. Slow, heavy, intentional. When Jacob unzipped the tent, a flashlight beam cut straight into his face. 3 men stood there, faces covered, voices low and cold. Aaron barely had time to speak before he was struck and knocked to the ground. From that moment on, everything moved fast. Their hands were bound. They were dragged from the campsite and forced deeper into the forest. No explanations, no threats. Only commands and violence. Jacob said they were tied to trees before dawn. 2 separate trunks. Close enough to see each other, but not close enough to touch. Aaron remembers the needle. A sharp sting in his neck, then a spreading heaviness, as if his body no longer belonged to him. The days that followed became mostly blank space. They woke up in intervals, not knowing whether it was day or night, not knowing how much time had passed. Sometimes they opened their eyes to see a face leaning down, checking their breathing, then disappearing. Jacob remembers a massive rainstorm. water pouring directly onto his face. He could not turn his head. He could not move. All he could do was breathe and endure. In a haze, he heard arguing. One voice said it had gone too far. Another snapped back, telling him to shut up. Then silence again. Aaron said there were moments when he stayed conscious long enough to hear a whisper. "You are still breathing." Good. That sentence followed him long after. Not because of how loud it was, but because of how calm it sounded. They were not beaten constantly. They were not tortured in the way people usually imagine. The most terrifying part was the waiting. Not knowing what would happen next. Not knowing if they would still be alive the next morning. They were given very little water. Injected with drugs multiple times. Enough to keep them disoriented. Enough to keep them alive. Doctors later said that without those injections, both men might have died sooner from shock or exhaustion. A cold truth. Difficult to accept. Jacob said what kept him alive was not strength. It was the thought of his family. He told himself that as long as he was still breathing, it was not over. Aaron was different. He held on to sound. The wind. The leaves. As a way to remind himself that the outside world still existed. When asked what had been the most frightening part of those 17 days, both men were silent for a long time. Then Jacob spoke. The most terrifying thing was knowing that someone decided each day whether we were allowed to keep living. Their testimony closed one part of the truth, but it opened something even darker. Because those 17 days were not chaos. They were controlled. They had rhythm. They had intention. 17 days in hell, designed by human hands. The trial took place the following spring, as the mountains around Maggie Valley began to turn green again. Outside the courthouse, nature continued its familiar cycle. Inside the courtroom, time felt locked inside 17 days no one wanted to remember. Travis Dell entered the courtroom in a prison uniform. He did not look around. He did not react. His face was cold and empty, as if what had happened had nothing to do with him. Eli and Cole sat in the row behind him, shoulders hunched. They looked far smaller than the figures described in the case files. No longer men of the forest, just defendants waiting for judgment. The prosecutor opened with a simple statement. This was not a missing persons case. This was a deliberate, prolonged, and cruel act of confinement. Each piece of evidence was presented to the jury. The rope, the sedatives found in the blood, cell phone data, security footage from Big Ben's grill. Nothing was rushed. Jacob and Aaron did not testify in open court. They appeared in a closed hearing, not out of fear, but because doctors confirmed that recounting the events in front of a crowd could cause serious psychological harm. Their statements were read aloud in the courtroom. The steady voice of the court clerk could not soften the weight of the words. When the description of being tied to trees and injected with drugs was read, several jurors lowered their heads. A few turned away. The defense argued that the defendants never intended to kill anyone, that they kept the victims alive, that this was a loss of control, not a calculated plan. But the argument did not hold, because keeping someone alive in pain is not mercy, it is a choice. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was silent. The judge looked directly at the defendants and said that what had occurred in that forest was an abuse of power at its most brutal. Travis Dell was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Eli received 28 years. Cole received 26 years. There were no shouts. No outbursts. Travis simply stared down at the table, hands still, expression unchanged, as if he had accepted it long ago. Outside the courthouse, Jacob's mother stood before the microphones. Her voice shook, but it was clear. Justice cannot give back what they lost. But at least it confirms that my son did not disappear for nothing. Aaron's father said only one sentence. They survived. And the people who did this will no longer be free. The trial ended, but the story did not. Because a sentence does not erase memory. It does not erase nights startled awake by wind and the smell of wet wood. Justice was spoken. But the cost of 17 days in hell will follow Jacob and Aaron for the rest of their lives. Survival was not the end. For Jacob and Aaron, it was only the beginning of another battle. Quieter, longer, and one no sentence could ever close. Their bodies slowly recovered. The rope marks faded with time. Weight returned. Medical readings stabilized. But what happened during those 17 days never left them. Jacob began to startle whenever it rained. The smell of wet wood made his heart race. His breathing turned shallow. Some nights he woke, gripping the sheets, because in his dreams he was still tied to a tree, still hearing wind move through the leaves like the whisper of a watcher standing nearby. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical term, but to Jacob, it meant never fully feeling safe, even inside the familiar room of his own home. Aaron was different. He was not afraid of rain. He was afraid of silence. Rooms that were too quiet made him restless. The sounds of the forest, once a source of peace, became triggers for panic. In his sleep, he heard the same familiar whisper. "You are still breathing. Good." That sentence followed him for years. Neither of them returned to the classroom. Their academic plans were left unfinished. Paths that once seemed open closed abruptly, not because they were weak, but because the old world no longer fit the people they had become. Jacob left North Carolina. He moved to a small town in Oregon, living near the woods, but no longer entering them the way he once had. People who knew him said he still liked to walk, but always paused for a long time before stepping onto narrow trails. Aaron stayed close to his family. He committed to therapy for many years. Sometimes progress came, sometimes it felt like starting over. He said the hardest part was not remembering what happened, but accepting that it had become part of who he was. Both men refused interviews, refused books, refused invitations to retell their own story. Not because they wanted the truth buried, but because every retelling meant returning to that forest. In one rare therapy session that was later documented, Jacob said something that left his doctor silent. "I survived, but part of me was left there." To outsiders, Jacob and Aaron became symbols of resilience, a rare miracle among countless unsolved disappearances. But to them, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like carrying an invisible scar, one no one else could see, but one that was always present. Trauma does not announce itself. It does not appear in headlines. It lives in sleepless nights, in panic without warning, and in the daily effort to keep going. Jacob and Aaron left the forest. But the forest never truly left them. There is a saying often repeated among search and rescue teams in the Appalachian region: "The forest never takes what it does not intend to keep." Jacob and Aaron were held for 17 days, not by the forest, but by human beings. When they were found, many people called it a miracle. But those who have truly walked those woods understand something deeper. The forest does not grant mercy. The forest is simply silent. Silent when people harm one another. Silent when cries for help are swallowed by fog and leaves. And silent until the truth can no longer be hidden. After the trial, life slowly settled back into place. The media moved on to news stories. The town returned to its familiar rhythm. Trails once again carried the footprints of hikers. But for Jacob and Aaron's families, time never returned to what it had been. Every rainfall, every fog-filled afternoon, served as a reminder that there are days when people vanish from this world without goodbye. A small wooden sign was placed near the trailhead where the search first began. Not large, not dramatic, just two names carved into the wood: Jacob Mills, Aaron Seiler, not to mark death, but to remember life. Hikers stop there. They leave bottles of water. They tie small pieces of string to nearby branches. A quiet reminder that the boundary between peace and cruelty can be fragile. This case is not only a story about crime, it is a story about power, about wounded ego, and about what happens when people believe that in places unseen, they are free to do anything. Jacob and Aaron came back, but they did not come back whole. A part of them remains in that forest, among the trees, the ropes, and the days without names. In the final report issued by investigators, one line was repeated more than once. They were not allowed to live, but the forest gave them back. Perhaps that is the most frightening, and also the most human, truth of this story. That even in the darkest places, the truth still finds a way into the light, and that not everything that disappears is forgotten.